Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. America's imperial interests weren't just limited to far-off places like Alaska or Hawaii, or things like cultural imperialism or economic imperialism. Sometimes it's good old-fashioned imperialism. Remember the Maine? Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to characterize the tensions between the United States and the Spanish Empire at the turn of the century. And you should be able to outline the course of the Spanish-American War and its results. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 11. Here I want to talk about the Spanish-American War. It's an interesting war. It's kind of one of the forgotten wars in American history, and it begins in Cuba. Cuba had fought for independence from Spain since 1868. They were always trying to get their independence from the Spanish Empire. Spain's rule over Cuba had been a cruel rule, and a lot of Americans were sympathetic to it. In a lot of ways, Americans saw the Cuban Rebellion as kind of like a different version of our own revolution. Several uprisings were attempted by the Cuban people with various levels of American support, or at least encouragement. In 1896, Spain reacted to those years of turmoil by sending in General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba, and his job was to go restore order to the country. He did so by ordering 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps. American newspapers who'd been following the uprisings were also eager to build up their circulation in a time of a circulation war, and so they seized on Victoriano Weyler's actions and began covering it. This takes us to a period of American journalistic history that I think is also important to understanding this particular context. And we know it as the era of yellow journalism. And there's two really publishers that we associate with yellow journalism, both of them strong New York voices. On one hand, you have William Randolph Hearst. He was the publisher of the New York Journal. And on the other hand, you have Joseph Pulitzer, the publisher of the New York World. And they both printed these, wildly exaggerated stories of the butcher Weyler and his brutality. Yellow journalism is a sensational style of writing just exaggerated news to lure and to engage readers into readership. Readers would know that I think the term we might use is truthy, like truth-ish, that readers kind of knew that these were exaggerated, but figured that it was based in truth. Newspapers would run stories about how the Spanish were poisoning the wells of Cuban people and were throwing Cuban children to sharks. And the reports would include these false names and details and dates, all of which were included with, like claims that the government would substantiate all of these reports if they were asked. And all of this was, fell on eager ears to American readers. It deepened American sympathy for the Cuban Rebellion. William Randolph Hearst sent a talented illustrator, a guy named Frederick Remington, to go bring back pictures of the fighting. To us today, this might seem a little confusing. Like, photography existed. Why didn't you send a photographer down? But photography was harder to get running in newspapers, particularly if it had to come from a long way away. An illustrator was actually a much faster way to convey news, and was seen as first-hand journalism. So Frederick Remington arrived in Havana to go capture images of what's going on in the rebellion in the streets. And when he arrived, he didn't actually find there was much rebellion at all. While the Weyler was imposing a type of martial law, it wasn't anything like the exaggerated claims that we were reading about in the newspapers. He actually sent a telegram back to William Randolph Hearst and said, there's actually not much likelihood of war going on here. And Hearst famously replied, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. The idea was to go get a first-hand account of something, and then they would create the news to go back up the image that was being sent. So that point C. President Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, had no interest in supporting the rebellion. While there was interest from the American people in supporting a Cuban rebellion, the American government, not so much. But he did worry about Spain's failure to end any conflicts coming up along the way. The war that was going on, the essentially civil war in Cuba, was disrupting trade between the United States and the Cuban island, and it was damaging American-owned sugar plantations that were there on the island. So there was a lot of Americans that owned farms and sugar farms, and that disruption of trade coming back to the United States was a problem. The next president, William McKinley, came into office in 1897, and he took a much stronger stance. He wanted to find a diplomatic way to bring peace to Cuba and threatened that he would bring force if necessary to do so. His threat that the United States would step up if Spain couldn't ensure a certain and early peace, and that threat actually seemed to work with the Spanish people. Spain's conservative regime backed down, and a liberal government took office in October of 1897. And there they offered Cuba some limited self-rule and said maybe it's time for Cuba to start to, if not get its own independence, at least take care of its own affairs. The General Victoriano Weyler was recalled to Spain, basically pulled out of Cuba, and the concentration camps were closed. So in a lot of ways it looks like McKinley's urging and not very thinly veiled threat was successful at bringing peace to the island. But there were also Spanish loyalists holding out in Cuba, particularly in Havana, and there they rioted against the proposal, and Cuban rebels held out for full independence. And while it looked like maybe some of the peace could be achieved, it was a long shot from a full peace. Then in February of 1898, the New York Journal published a private letter from Enrique de Lome. Enrique de Lome was a Spanish minister to the United States. So he's basically the Spanish ambassador to the United States, and he's cabling messages back to Spain based on his diplomatic work. And what's known as the de Lome letter, he writes that the McKinley administration wasn't very strong, that McKinley himself was a weak leader who just followed public opinion, and it seemed insulting to the American government. The letter intensified the indignation against Spain. So like the American public are like, oh, we don't like Spain to begin with, and now they're making fun of our president. Spain apologized. They backed down from it. They fired de Lome. They recall him back to Spain. But the American public felt insulted and were, eager to go get some redress for their grievances. Subpoint D. McKinley ordered the USS Maine, which was an armored warship. We met it earlier in this unit, talking about how the United States Navy was modernizing after the urge to, bring our naval capacity into the modern day. The Maine was one of the examples of one of those warships. McKinley ordered the USS Maine into Cuba, into Havana's harbor, to go evacuate U.S. citizens that were trapped in this increasing civil war on the Cuban island, and to also protect U.S. property there as well. And on February 15th of 1898, just a couple of days after the publishing of the de Lome letter, while stationed in Havana's harbor, the USS Maine exploded suddenly and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Over 260 men were killed on the ship, and Americans immediately suspected the Spanish of blowing up the Maine with undersea mines. The Spanish government immediately commissioned an exploration into the deal and an investigation into the accident. And the Spanish investigation concluded that neither the characteristics of the explosion or the sea conditions in the harbor, nor any other evidence along the way supported the idea of the ship being mined in harbor. Rather, the Spanish report concluded that the ship itself must have exploded, that the coal bunker, the fuel for the ship, might have accidentally ignited, which did happen from time to time, and that would have blown up the ship. And the Spanish report, though, wasn't reported in the American press. We weren't really interested to hear what the Spanish had to say about this. The American press took a different story. And McKinley generally thought that the explosion was probably an accident, but the United States Navy convened a board of inquiry to go in and try to get to the bottom of the deal. There they found that the keel of the ship, sort of the backbone of the ship, the keel of the ship had been broken in half in what looked like an external explosion, not an internal one. They concluded that a mine under the ship caused secondary explosions inside the coal and ammunition holds of the ship. The board of inquiry report, that's the one that was reported in the American press, prompting outrage. Later, dive investigations have tended to confirm that the ammunition holds exploded, but it's still unclear whether that was caused by an internal or an external explosion that ignited the ammunition chips from there, the ammunition hold from there. And the truth is, we'll probably never know with any kind of certainty. Subpoint E. Newspapers nevertheless ran with the idea and published the news that the Spanish had blown up the boat. William Randolph Hearst offered a $50,000 reward for the the capture of any of the Spaniards who were responsible for the explosion. Hesitant business leaders became impatient, believing that, you know what, nobody wants war, but war would be better because it shows action, preferable to an unending Cuban crisis. Public opinion solidified behind that movement of war with the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." On March 27th, McKinley ordered an ultimatum to Madrid, immediate armistice for 6 months, just like immediately stop any fighting in Cuba for 6 months, and the United States would then serve as a mediator and a peace negotiator with the rebels. In order to avoid a full-out war with the United States, Spain agreed, and they basically agreed with every American demand along the way, including a 6-month ceasefire in Cuba altogether. But they refused to give Cuba its own independence. There was like this myth of Spain that like Cuba was the jewel of the Spanish Empire, and losing it would be the end of all of Spain. They say they would rather it sink into the ocean than give it its independence. On April 11th, McKinley, tired of waiting for the Spanish to move, asked Congress for the authority to go intervene in Cuba, and on April 20th, the United States declared war against the country of Spain. And that takes us to Roman numeral number 12, war. The first battle occurred not in Cuba, which would actually make sense, but in a different Spanish colony in the Philippines. I mean, declaring war against the country means declaring war against all of its places. And if part of Spain is over in the Pacific Ocean in the Philippines, then that's part of Spain. And the United States there believed that we could attack the Spanish ships without expectation. So on April 30th, American Commodore George Dewey trapped the Spanish fleet in the harbor of Manila. The next morning, he opened fire into the harbor. The attack was so intense that these clouds of smoke were totally blocking the view of the Spanish, and yet Dewey just continued to attack, firing into the cloud of smoke. A munitions clerk made a sudden counting error and feared that the United States was going to use up all of its ammunition shooting into this cloud of smoke, and if the Spanish began a counterattack, the United States couldn't actually defend itself in Manila Harbor. So Dewey, in a panic, ordered the United States to stop firing, hold your fire. When the smoke cleared, they realized why the Spanish didn't fire back. The entire Spanish fleet in the Philippines was destroyed. Entire fleet in the Philippines was destroyed. Dewey's victory then allowed the United States troops to go land onto the islands without much conflict, subpoint B. And many believed that American participation in the destruction of Spanish rule would lead to social reform and political self-government. The conditions in the Philippines weren't as extreme as they were in Cuba, but they were still pretty similar. And there was also a similar revolt movement at foot in the Philippines. It was led by a guy named Emiliano Aguinaldo, and he supported Dewey's efforts to go take the islands. The McKinley administration basically teams up with Aguinaldo to go say Aguinaldo had been leading this guerrilla force to go fight against the Spaniards. The Americans show up. Basically, we team up with Aguinaldo to go put down any of the Spanish control of the islands. McKinley looks at this and he says, "Oh, this is a great idea," and he begins to justify. McKinley was originally not an imperialist. That's not really originally his motive, but he becomes one through the course of his presidency. And he began to justify the United States intervention into the Philippines on the ground that the United States had an obligation to its little brown brothers. There's kind of a heavy cultural and racist imperialism that's running on this. He tried weakly to justify the idea that America's annexation of the Philippines, just make it an American colony now, was a moral idea that the Philippines should be educated and should be Christianized, ignoring the fact that Christianity had actually been part of the Philippines since the 16th century and was one of the most Christian countries in that corner of the world. McKinley changed his position on Philippine independence to just American possession. And when he did that, Aguinaldo, who was originally excited that the Americans were showing up, switched his position, and Aguinaldo then began leading a guerrilla war against the Americans because from his point of view, it was just trading one colonial oppressor with another, this time against American imperialism, subpoint C. The United States presence in Cuba. Let us turn our eyes back to, remember this is about Cuba? The United States presence in Cuba began with a naval blockade. So American ships going and surrounding the island of Cuba from there, sealing the Spanish fleet into the harbor of Santiago de Cuba, not letting any Spanish ships come in or out from there. Unlike the United States Navy, the United States Army actually wasn't that big of a thing. Our Navy, we had been modernizing it, trying to make it into a modern fighting force, but the Army kind of lagged behind it. And there actually weren't enough volunteers, not enough enlisted soldiers to go really take Cuba to do so. Mostly, and the ones that did were kind of underprepared and ill-supplied volunteers. Around 125,000 Americans volunteered to go fight in Cuba, but there weren't actually enough even guns to go around to go arm this new army, and the uniforms were left over from the Civil War days. There were these heavy wool uniforms that were kind of poorly suited for go fighting in a Caribbean tropical climate. Officers were also more eager to go tell the stories of the Civil War than they were to go train the soldiers, and so they sent their troops into battle ill-prepared and under-equipped. Subpoint D. In June of 1898, 17,000 troops landed in Santiago de Cuba, including the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry regiment under the direction of Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt. Convinced that war would just go reinvigorate a sense of manliness in the American troops, Teddy Roosevelt resigned as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to go switch branches and go lead this unit of the cavalry of the American Army. On July 1st, the most famous battle in Cuba took place near Santiago. It was the first part of the battle was on Kettle Hill. The Kettle Hill was this risky uphill charge led by two African-American regiments and the Rough Riders. That cleared the way for the United States to take the more strategically important San Juan Hill, where Roosevelt and the Rough Riders truthfully only played a fairly minor role in it, but Roosevelt was considered the hero of San Juan Hill. 2 days later, the Spanish fleet tried to escape the American blockade, and it led to a naval battle that destroyed basically the entire Spanish fleet. The United States troops invaded Puerto Rico soon thereafter. Subpoint E is the Treaty of Paris. Spain and the United States signed an armistice in August of 1898, and then they met in Paris to go make a treaty. Secretary of State John Hay called the conflict a splendid little war, with the actual fighting in Cuba lasting only about 15 weeks. Spain freed Cuba and handed Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for about $20 million. It's okay. The terms of the settlement of the Treaty of Paris of 1898 was that Cuba gets its independence. We do not take it as an American colony. The Philippines do not get handed over to the Americans. We officially buy it. So we officially buy the Philippines, but Guam and Puerto Rico are basically just given to us as terms of settlement. America's interest in its new possessions had more to do with trade than it did from gaining wealth from natural resources or large U.S. settlements. In 1899, the Secretary of State John Hay, he of the splendid little war, announced what would be known as the open door policy. The open door policy is basically how the United States is going to go, deal with the rest of the world. He demanded that European powers should not close the door of trade, in particular with China, although we'll begin to use the open door policy with other countries as well, to go trade in the United States in the areas they control. The Treaty of Paris would start a debate over imperialism, things like whether or not it was right to annex the Philippines at all. Opponents to imperialism gave political and moral and economic arguments against annexation. Nevertheless, the Treaty of Paris was ratified by Congress in 1899, and it gave the United States an empire which included Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. The American footprint is now expanding over some pretty important and far-flung places of the globe. Subpoint F. While American rule also brought, while it brought American control, it also brought American racial attitudes. The concept of the white man's burden, like it was just the white people's job to go civilize the places of non-white people, it's not uniquely American, but it definitely affected America's views on imperialism. America's triumphant entry into the ranks of imperial imperial powers sparked an intense debate over the relationship between political democracy and race and American citizenship. The Foraker Act of 1900 declared Puerto Rico to be an insular territory, and it was different from the other territories of the West. By the 20th century, the American territories in 1898 would follow different paths. Hawaii would go achieve its own statehood by really kind of late 1959. The Philippines got its independence after World War II. Puerto Rico, sometimes called the world's oldest colony, was governed as a semi-autonomous territory today. But in general, this is where America goes and meets the rest of the world. It's where we emerge onto the world scene as a major player, where the United States can go tangle with old and venerable powers of Europe and even come out victorious for the win. This story of America dealing with the rest of the world is the game changer, and it's a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.